Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Lent is a tough time of year, and intentionally so, I think, because it's a time where we're supposed to reflect on human fragility. This year, Lent is a little later, but typically it hits us right in the hardest season of the year. The time when the nights are long and cold, the time when we're feeling particularly vulnerable. The joy and warmth of Christmas is past. We've enjoyed the snow, and now we're probably tired of the salt and slush. We're into the long slog of waiting for spring. And it's no coincidence that Easter happens at the beginning of spring. Easter is the day we celebrate the resurrection. We emerge from our hibernation into the greening grass and the buds on the trees. There's a liturgical feel for emerging into the spring at Easter time. And I feel like there's a bit of a joke here about Presbyterians being dreary and depressing, but Lent is kind of supposed to be. If Easter is our reminder that God brings healing and new life, then Lent is our reminder that we need it. I always feel a little awkward in Lent because I want to leave you with good news at the end of the sermon. I want to leave you sort of feeling very hopeful, but with Lent we're supposed to sort of sit a little more than usual with the tension of our limitations. It's a very introspective time, and it's supposed to break into the joy of resurrection on Easter Sunday. So it's fitting, I think, that we compare Lent with Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. Now this year we read the story in Mark, and he mentions it almost in a passing way. There's just a handful of verses there, and he covered 3 things. The other Gospels go into more details, and this is sort of a choice for Jesus between the human and the divine. Because, it's meant to foreshadow the nature of Jesus' ministry and how it's bigger than we can imagine. Looking at the other temptation stories, all the things Jesus is tempted with are actually good things. For instance, if he can turn stones to bread, then he can feed all the world's hungry. If Jesus the Christ ruled all the kingdoms of the world, there would be world peace and true justice. If angels would always protect him, then he would be invincible and be able to do all sorts of superhero-like things. If Jesus gave into the temptations of the devil in the wilderness, he would have been able to do all sorts of good. But even these good things fall short of Jesus' dream for our world. Jesus is not talking about fixing individual problems himself. He's talking about fixing the whole system and convincing us to do the work. Because if we don't want a perfect world, it's not going to be a perfect world, right? He's working towards our buy-in of a perfect world. And that's what his temptation in the wilderness signifies. An intentional time of turning towards this dream that is bigger than we can dream. A dream that is impossible in a world where we think death is the end of the story. Lent is about the same. Easter symbolizes the possibility for the dream. Lent is where that dream forms. Now, mental health is something that we should always pay attention to. And to be frank, as a society, we haven't. I don't think it was a conversation we had the time for or even the idea to talk about until the 60s and probably well into the 70s. Think about the history here. Even today, farming is still hard work, and the further back you go, the harder it was, and the more of an agricultural or at least industrial society you were. There wasn't time or the support to talk about mental health or illness in this sort of rural, labor-based society that we had until the war period. And then we had 2 wars and a major economic crisis. So suddenly, there were millions of veterans and economic refugees figuring out how to cope on their own, often self-medicating or becoming emotionally distant. I can't blame us for not realizing the discussion around mental health was important for so long. It probably appeared that people were coping, but today we know that they weren't. We all know someone from the war generation especially that was emotionally distant or perhaps drank a little more than they should have or was carrying some heavy burden. We know things were hidden or out of sight. And it's taken probably 40 or so years since we've started having this conversation for us to be honest as a society about the way we are perceiving the world. Now, I found it useful to think about mental health as analogous to physical health. In fact, someone here, and I forget who it was, it sounds like a Kathy thing to say, but I forget who it was, pointed out that if your brain is a physical organ and mental health problems are problems with your brain, then mental health problems are in fact physical health problems. They're just harder to see and to understand. Let's take a moment and talk about the difference between mental health and mental illness. We will be talking about both of these throughout the season, but we should differentiate. Mental health might be comparable to your physical health in that it's just your general state of being. You are physically healthy if you eat right and exercise, etc., etc. We've all heard that spiel. Similarly, if you are taking care of your mental health, you'll be in a similarly healthy mental state as well. Mental illness is more acute. If you have a mental health issue that is preventing you from living your life for a longer period, then it's become a mental illness. It might be analogous to how eating habits can lead to diabetes or heart problems in that way. Another way to look at it is that it's the same as you might get sick. A mental illness might develop, like schizophrenia maybe. Or the way you might be hurt from trauma. Say you suffer a trauma, physical trauma, and break your leg. Well, mental trauma can cause mental illness as well, things like PTSD. This is how the Canadian Mental Health Association explains mental health. Mental health is a state of well-being, and we all have it. Just like we each have a state of physical health, we also each have our mental health to look after. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. It's enjoying life, having a sense of purpose, and being able to manage life's highs and lows. And I think that word purpose is very important. They give us 5 common factors tied to good mental health. And they all tie into purpose or community somehow. Here's the 5 things. A sense of purpose. Strong relationships. Feeling connected to others. Having a good sense of self. Coping with stress. And enjoying life. All these things seem to me to be very much our business as a church. We are a group of people who share God's vision for the world. To use more traditional language, we are all working to build God's kingdom in the way only we specifically can. And that creates this sense of purpose, community, satisfaction, and enjoyment of life. We call it, in the church, a sense of calling. God calls each of us to play a specific role. And we support each other in discerning and acting on that call. Now, as we come to a close in this it's a general introduction to the Lenten series this year, I'd like to leave you with a couple of important practical points. First is that mental health is very much worth talking about. The temptation is there to discount it. But this is something we need to be talking about, and it's something the church clearly has business talking about. And that leads me to the second point, which is to be open. If you are struggling, or know someone who is struggling, it is important that it be known that we're all in this together. Talking about it, if you are struggling, helps others to help you. Talking about it, if you are not struggling, sends the message that it is okay to be feeling this way and okay to talk about it. We tend not to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. There's an unhealthy history of us just sucking it up and getting on with life. We are never comfortable being vulnerable. But especially in terms of mental health, it is so important that we know that we're not in this alone. And that point literally saves lives. Thirdly, we need to be honest about how we help. And that means two things. One, listening before acting, and it also means healthy boundaries. We have a very strong culture of trying to help without asking what is the matter or what a person needs. Often it's even considered chivalrous or a way of showing love when you don't need to be told how to help. But more and more people are being vocal about the fact that unwanted help or misguided help is itself unhelpful. Especially if the situation is already difficult and now you're managing another person in a difficult situation. And with mental health or illness, our perceptions of the world are not clear. It is especially imperative that we ask people what their perception of the world is so that we understand, so that we find out how they are perceiving the world before we rush to help, because it's guaranteed that we're not going to understand it with mental health. We need that understanding. And this means that we also need to set up boundaries. In the Canadian Mental Health Association website, they just over and over and over again indicated that for everybody's sake, you need to set up boundaries. If a person is not perceiving the world clearly, then there are bound to be misunderstandings. Now, we're going to register those misunderstandings in a lot of cases as bad behavior. We need to be clear about what we need in order to give help. Give this person clear expectations so that there are as few bumps in the road as possible. And make your limits clear as well. This is a tough one, but you would not commit to being the sole caregiver of, for instance, a cancer patient without thinking about your abilities first. What would make mental illness different? So through Lent, let's make sure to keep this conversation going. If Lent is a reminder that we need big systematic change, let's dream big. If we have stories that we are free to share, let's share them. Let's be intentional about creating a community that supports people in being their best selves in order to build God's kingdom the way God specifically made each and every one of us. Let's be a community where this conversation is clearly out in the open, so that people do not feel alone or like they are any different than the rest of us. On the CMHA website, it says this: 1 in 5 people in Canada will experience a mental health problem or illness in any given year. But 5 in 5 of us have mental health. Think about that. Amen.